Well, it is noon Eastern Time. I am pleased to welcome you to Perspectives on Philanthropy. These are conversations that provide context. It is a series that seeks perspective on the world of philanthropy as we entered the pandemic, how we have pivoted to deal with its urgency, how we might be raising our sights to peer into the world that might emerge, and how we can participate in creating what it will look like. Since we started the series in May, we have witnessed an upsurge of protests for racial justice after the killing of George Floyd. The philanthropic response to the protest has also been remarkable, engaging a broad swath of the American population, even reaching beyond our shores. The newly amplified quest for racial justice has added a new dimension to our time of crisis. At the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, we believe that curiosity-based research and scholarship on the field is illuminating, and we also seek to connect rigorous research to the vital insights of practitioners. Engaging practitioners and leaders in the field works to advance knowledge and improve practice. We are very pleased to share these conversations. And we think that following one's curiosity is not only its own reward, but that it can lead to more thoughtful and effective voluntary action and systematic generosity. We are very, very pleased today to have as our guest Fay Twersky, Vice President of the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. She works closely with the foundation's president, Larry Kramer, who we were fortunate to welcome to the school during our 50th anniversary in 2017. Fay manages special initiatives to improve the foundation's grant making and discrete projects that fall outside its traditional programs. Fay also leads the foundation's Effective Philanthropy Group. The team, which she shaped and launched in 2012, guides strategy, evaluation, and organizational learning within the Hewlett Foundation, and also leads grant making in support of organizational effectiveness and a strong philanthropic sector. Fay spent 2010 and 2011 working in Jerusalem, advising Yad Hanadiv, the Rothschild Family Foundation. She served for 4 years as director and member of the leadership team also of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, designing and developing the Impact Planning and Improvement Division. She was also a founding principal of BTW Informing Change, a strategic consulting firm. Fay is a frequent author and commentator on trends in philanthropy. Her publications include a Stanford Social Innovation Review article titled Time for a Three-Legged Measurement Stool, about balancing monitoring and evaluation with feedback from ultimate beneficiaries. Also, she authored The Artful Juggler on what it takes to be a successful foundation CEO. Also, Listening to Those Who Matter Most, the Beneficiaries, and A Guide to Actionable Measurement. She serves on the boards of the Center for Effective Philanthropy and the UBS Optimus Foundation. She is also the founding co-chair for the Fund for Shared Insight. She holds 2 bachelor's degrees, one in Middle Eastern Studies and Rhetoric, with high honors from the University of California, Berkeley, and a master's degree in city planning from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Fay and her wife, Jill, have 2 great kids, Jazz and David Nathan, and they frequently enjoy far-reaching family conversations over delicious home-cooked dinners. Fay, it is my pleasure to welcome you to Perspectives on Philanthropy. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Amir. That was quite an introduction, but thank you. I appreciate being here.
Wonderful. We're so pleased you're with us, and only sorry that you're not with us in person. So I will start us off with a few questions, and then we will turn to our audience.
Great.
Let's begin with the moment that we are in, and let's get a little bit of context on the Hewlett Foundation before we consider some broader trends. How have you experienced the calls for racial justice in the wake of the killing of George Floyd, and unfortunately we had the killing of Jacob Blake just a few days ago, and how has the foundation responded?
Yeah, unbelievable what we're seeing. I mean, it is believable and also unbelievable at the same time, really. Amir, the killings in the midst of a pandemic. So in terms of how we have responded, our entire foundation, from all of our staff, our board, have been quite disturbed by the killings, and also, I would say, motivated to do something. Like this is we have not historically been a big funder in racial justice explicitly, although many of our strategies do center equity, have for a while centered equity and racial issues in them. But this moment for us has caused us to further that commitment. The board has encouraged us to be bold in responding to this moment. And in July, the board approved 2 special initiatives. One, to make $18 million in anti-racism grants this year, which I could talk more about, but I'm leading a process with the rest of the staff and to involve the rest of the staff in making those grants this year. And then also approved a $150 million 10-year initiative, special initiative to address racism in this country that will begin in 2021. So we're trying to both, respond to the moment, meet the moment, and support those organizations who are doing just critical anti-racism work, and also, as is our general orientation, think about the longer term view. What will it take for any changes? Because we are at this, both at a terrible moment and also a hopeful moment for change. So what will it take for the possibility of change to really happen and to endure? So that's what the longer term initiative will be focused on.
That's terrific. And as you look at the field in general, which you often do, and we'll get to a lot of those questions, the response from the society as a whole and the field in general, does any of it surprise you, or what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually pretty heartened by the response of the field, I would say. All of the big foundations have committed funds, new funds for this, as far as I can tell. I haven't done a complete survey, but just looking around at our peers, there's been just a terrific response and commitment and pledges and new grant making in this area. So from the perspective of the big foundations, and really foundations of all sizes, we're seeing important new commitments, some with existing dollars being used in new ways, and some with new dollars being allocated. And that's been true also for other givers. So I just recently have completed a little analysis of donor advised funds, which are, get a lot of critique, but they have also been the donor advised fund community has been incredibly generous in these last few months, not just for the pandemic, but increasingly for issues of racial justice. There's just been a significant increase from both not only donor advised funds held in community foundations, these are funds that individuals hold, but also through the bigger DAF sponsors like Fidelity, Vanguard, Schwab. A lot more funding is being given to racial justice issues. Not enough, a lot more that everybody can do, and we need to, but also I think a pretty good response.
Yeah, definitely. The half the DAF movement, and it seems that a lot of the donors are really responding, and even the big ones are stepping up to the plate.
Yeah,
that's definitely heartening. So the calls for racial justice have happened just at a time, and perhaps in reaction to the fact that the pandemic is exposing inequities in our society. Tell us a little bit about kind of the pandemic response, its effect on your grantees, and how you're operating in a pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I'll just say, I think pandemics and crises like this often do this. I'm reminded of when I was in graduate school. I know many of your audience is students, but when I was in graduate school, it was during the AIDS epidemic, the first decade of the AIDS epidemic. And similarly, the AIDS epidemic in the late 80s also revealed the fault lines of our society in terms of who was getting it and who was caring and so forth. So I think these are often moments that can be really both horrific, but also can lead us to do better. So we have done a number of things in response to the pandemic. Many of our grantees are, I would say it's sort of split. Many of them are doing okay. Grantees that work on longer term policy issues, they are not devastated economically by the pandemic and loss of revenue. I would say the grantees that are the worst off right now are the ones that rely on revenue from income, ticket sales. So we're a big among our main programs is the Performing Arts program, which is one of our loveliest programs, and we support the arts in the Bay Area, and we believe that a vibrant Bay Area needs a vibrant arts sector. But the arts community has just been devastated. They are performing arts. They perform in person, and without ticket sales, they've just been devastated. So we have allocated a lot of our funding this year, and an extra $15 million just to save some of these organizations that would otherwise go out of business. And our performing arts team is in the process right now of figuring out how best to support those organizations, but we're committed to the sector. We've been a longtime supporter of many of these community-based arts organizations, and we want to see them be there after this pandemic is over. We've also, we take our citizenship locally in the Bay Area quite seriously too, and we have allocated a special $10 million COVID relief grant to the Silicon Valley Community Foundation that has organized a regional response in the 9 Bay Area counties. And they're very well set up. They know the organizations in the region who can get direct funds, direct relief out to people who need it. And so that's what we've been doing locally as well.
That's great. That's great. Yeah, the research on the arts in recessions shows that that's one of the hardest hit areas usually.
Yeah.
Typically in these kind of area in situations. So I'm sure they're glad that you're helping sustain them through this time. Yeah. Tell us a little bit more about your portfolio in normal times. What is it? What is it?
And it seems like we're just not ever going to be back in normal times, but I have kind of 3 portfolios, and happy to talk about any and all of them, Amir. The first is, as you mentioned in your very kind introduction, the Effective Philanthropy Group, which I can come back to, but it is a little bit of an unusual team in the foundation world. And we work internally across all of our programs, helping to guide strategy, evaluation, and learning, creating and sustaining a vibrant learning environment. And we also do grant making to support a strong sector. That's the Effective Philanthropy Group. I also am responsible for our Serving Bay Area Communities program, which gives locally, and our main programs there are focused on addressing the housing crisis, which has been quite acute in the Bay Area, and supporting environmental leaders, emerging environmental leaders in California. And then I also lead and represent us in a variety of special initiatives that fall outside of kind of the regular program areas. And so just to give you a couple of examples, one of the initiatives that we are part of is the Blue Meridian Partners, which is a new kind of collaboration among different kinds of funders that is, quite a large collaboration, ambitious collaboration, bringing together individual high net worth funders like giving pledgers and institutional funders to really make a meaningful difference, aggregating philanthropic capital and investing in supporting the most disadvantaged youth in the nation to have more opportunity. So we try to partner with those kinds of philanthropic innovations. I'm helping support and get started another collaborative on pluralism, which is, addressing the crisis of connection in our country, is something I feel quite passionately about.
Oh, that's fascinating. Can you tell us just a little bit more about the Pluralism Project? That in an election year, that seems like really interesting.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because we are just in the early stages of formation, but we are. It goes beyond just politics or party affiliation. There are many funders who are focused on red, blue, interaction. That's part of what we are concerned about, but we're also concerned about all all the other ways that we are maybe different from one another in our nation. It could have to do with issues of class or geography or faith or race. It could be many, many different facets of our identities. And how do we create more connective tissue between us so that there are more bonds of connection and trust. So there are different efforts that are going on that we want to support, and then we want to support some new efforts, and we want to, importantly, in our collaborative itself, model the kind of difference that we are seeking to also support more of in the field. So our funder collaborative will also be ideologically diverse.
Fascinating. That's terrific. Well, we at the school always talk about how plural and different and various philanthropy is. People often have the picture of usually a very wealthy old white person, man, and I think that's philanthropy. Whereas we like to think of it as the human condition, and always exploring the variety of ways in which that is manifested across the human condition. So that sounds fascinating. Let's talk a little bit more about kind of the effective philanthropy, because you're one of the few foundations that has been a steadfast supporter of infrastructure and capacity building, both kind of building the field and building the organizational capacity of nonprofits to be able to achieve their goals more strategically. Why is this so important to Hewlett, and how have you advanced your strategy in this area?
Yeah. Well, any mature field has infrastructure, and as philanthropy has grown, having some infrastructure is quite important. Sometimes we when we talk about why this is important, we show that the Pompidou, the museum in France, in Paris, that has the the piping and all the internal workings outside of the infrastructure, so that you can actually see all the inner workings. And most of the time we hide that, but it's actually essential to function. You need to have all that infrastructure, and so we feel that it's important to be a good citizen of the sector, and being a good citizen means supporting the infrastructure, so that as new funders come into being, they have a place to go to understand, what does good philanthropy look like? How do I organize my grant making? What should bylaws be about? How do I achieve impact? What are the different models of giving, if I want to give locally or nationally or internationally? There's, how do I convert and translate my passions into impact and results? And even existing funders need to know how to do that. And so supporting the infrastructure feels just critical, and also high leverage. We can have influence, not just through the grant making that we do in programs, but if we can help all the other foundations be more effective, all the better. So we have a few different ways that we go about supporting infrastructure. Some of it has to do with supporting the infrastructure of the philanthropic sector, and some of it the infrastructure of our grantee community. So I'll talk first about the supporting the infrastructure of our grantee partners. So we tend to give, whenever we can, general operating support, long-term general operating support to our grantee partners, multi-year. We try to find organizations to support that are consistent with our strategies and goals, and support them in the long term and build that kind of relationship with them. But we know that even when we provide that kind of support, which grantees tell us they really appreciate and need more of, that they still need targeted investment to support their internal capacities. So we have a special portfolio of funds called our Organizational Effectiveness Funds, which represents about 2% of the foundation's giving in any given year. And those funds are used to support relatively smaller grants, usually as a supplement to the general operating support, to help support those grantee organizations to do the work that is really critical for being a healthy, resilient organization. So they're used to do things like improve, develop a new financial accounting system, or plan for succession, or develop new bylaws for my board, or hire a search consultant for a great COO. Things that are the unsexy parts of an organization that most funders don't want to fund, that most funders want to fund program, but actually are just critical for organizations to be well run. And nonprofits are so undercapitalized that even though there may be organizations that we may give a $2 million general operating support grant to, when we give them a $45,000 organizational effectiveness grant, they are so happy. They are the most popular grants that we probably give in our foundation, believe it or not, because most funders don't want to fund that. And it's even hard for grantees to use their general operating support grant for some of that internal work for a variety of reasons. There's still pressure to use that general operating money for programmatic purposes only. So that's one way where we can sort of give the leaders of organization cover in a way where they have to use that funding to take care of their own internal business and build their capacity in strategic ways.
Well, I salute the fact that you are trying to in some ways bust the overhead myth. Investing in operations and talent is not is not come at the expense of programmatic outcomes. You need those to create consistent programmatic outcomes. Are you seeing that you're gaining more adherence to your view among other funders? Are you succeeding in convincing others about how important this is?
Well, it remains to be seen. I think the whole point around general operating support, there's been a big drumbeat to do more general operating support in the sector for a couple decades. And according to the data that we have, it doesn't seem to have made much of a difference in terms of increasing the proportion of general operating support. But I don't know, with the pandemic and the calls to fund differently, there's recently a funder pledge, 800 funders or more now signed on to this pledge to say, we're pledging to adopt, these behaviors during this pandemic. We're hoping that some of these behaviors endure. And one of them had to do with providing more general operating support, reducing the reporting burden on grantees, and so forth. So the Center for Effective Philanthropy is doing some research now to see if actually that pledge is translating into new behaviors. So remains to be seen. It may be short term, hopefully be longer term, but we don't yet know. Hopeful. Yeah, we never know in terms of what kind of the discontinuities in a crisis are going to stick, and then what people are just going to go back to the old way of doing things. So I guess it remains to be seen. So you have a relatively new newsletter called The Listening Post, and you write about, in the latest edition, you write, and I would recommend it to our audience to check it out. It's on the Hewlett Foundation website, and you can sign up for it to get, I think, monthly updates. Roughly, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I see that folks are starting to type in questions. So I do want to encourage our audience to put in your questions in the chat function, and we'll get to them shortly. So in the latest edition, you say that you had an epiphany when you were at the Gates Foundation building their planning and improvement operation. And you write that that's when you realized the importance of listening more to beneficiaries rather than experts. Tell us a little bit about how your focus on listening has informed your perspective on what works in philanthropy.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Amir. I have a new listening post coming out shortly about donor advised funds, so you can look for that one coming to your inbox soon. Yeah, I joined the Gates Foundation in 2006-07. Well, in 2006, and I think it was about 2007 where I had this epiphany. I was helping to build a new team at the foundation there, just to give you a little context. It was at the time that Warren Buffett had just made his amazing gift, doubling the giving of the foundation pretty much overnight. And the foundation wanted to develop an internal team that would help all of the programs in the foundation be more consistent in how they developed strategies, measured results. And the third part of that remit was to help the foundation hear from outside voices. And happy to talk about the other two, but the other two I had more experience with. I had a sense of what it would mean to develop some common frameworks for strategy and some ways to go about doing measurement work. And I was less sure about what did it mean to listen to outside voices. And one day I was sitting at my desk at the Gates Foundation, and I had this feeling in the pit of my stomach. I knew that the foundation was very good at listening to experts. We were getting a little bit better at listening to grantee perspectives and voices, but I felt very far away from the people and communities that we were seeking to help with our funding. And I realized that those were the voices that I thought we needed to hear from better. So I asked some of my colleagues around the foundation if they wanted to sort of do an experiment to help see if we couldn't elevate the voices of the people that we were seeking to help. Longer story there, but we launched initially a special initiative called the Student Voice Initiative, which later became Youth Truth, which is a nationwide student survey that authentically lifts up the voices of students to understand their experience in the classroom and have that those perspectives find their way into the consideration of school leaders and teachers and funders of those efforts. There was a similar effort in our agriculture team, lifting up smallholder farmer voice and understanding their perspective. But I through that experience, began to realize that it was quite important to lift up those perspectives. You know, that the Gates Foundation at the time was investing in small schools and collected a lot of data about schools, about matriculation rates and grades and graduation rates and so forth. Just a ton of information, but nothing from the students. And if this were a business, to run a business without getting consumer feedback would be just unthinkable. And so that experience sort of led me on, you know, an ongoing journey and kind of passion of mine to see if we can't amplify the voices of those who are least heard and maybe most important in this whole you know, system of players. And when I started at the Hewlett Foundation, I was fortunate enough to be able to launch a new initiative with another group of funders called the Fund for Shared Insight. And our whole purpose of that funder collaborative is to create more meaningful connections between funders, nonprofits, and the people and communities that we are seeking to benefit and lift up their voices.
Yeah, the Fund for Shared Insight is now kind of a well-known locus for people who are interested in exactly what you're talking about. Has this listening kind of model informed your kind of emergency response to racial justice that you talked about at the outset?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that, you know, there are many different forms of listening. So I would recommend to your listeners, to your audience, that we commissioned a scan recently from Valerie Threlfall, who's kind of an expert in this area as well, to look at what are all the different ways that foundations are listening to community. And there's a whole, you know, framework that she has developed. So I can talk about our COVID response, but also some other ways that we have been listening. So in terms of our COVID response, we explicitly gave, as I mentioned earlier, the $10 million grant to the Silicon Valley Community Foundation because they have partners who are doing listening, who are themselves rooted in community and listening to community needs. That for for the Hewlett Foundation with an office in Menlo Park, or now we're remote, but we didn't have the same reach deep into community that the Community Foundation has. So one way of listening is partnering with other organizations, in this case, the Community Foundation, which are great community partners, many of them, to partner with them who, they do have roots in community and have vehicles for listening. Other forms of listening need to be specific to the programmatic work and context that you're working in. So, another example I can offer is from our performing arts team. When they were refreshing their strategy last year, pre-pandemic, they went out to community and had listening circles with community members who lived in communities where they began to say, we're funding deserts, but not arts deserts. So there was arts happening there, but they were very underfunded. And so our team went out and listened in community organizations to community members to understand what were their aspirations for performing arts, what might support for performing arts look like in those communities. And out of that, they came away with a lot of good ideas that they wouldn't have thought of just sitting in our offices in Menlo Park.
That's great. Well, listening is one form of, I guess, gathering knowledge. And I think we have been collaborating with Hewlett to figure out how we can get, more research and better knowledge to circulate in the field. And I think, we all believe that, research is something that helps build capacity both for the field and for organizations as well. But what are some of the challenges and obstacles that nonprofits you see face in accessing kind of more systematic knowledge wherever it comes from?
Yeah. Well, I will answer your question, but also another one. That is, nonprofits face obstacles, but so do knowledge producers. And researchers. So the obstacles faced by nonprofits. Nonprofits are doing a million things, and they, as I said before, they are undercapitalized, most of them, and they don't often have people on their teams who know the literature, who know all the evidence, who have easy access to it, who can stay up on it. It takes resources to understand research, to understand its implications for your programs. And research evolves. So I think amidst all the different priorities of nonprofits and all the things they have to cover with their resources, keeping the rent going and the doors open and so forth, accessing evidence it takes resources that they often don't have. There have been a variety, as you know, of efforts over the years in pretty much every field to create translational vehicles, what works clearinghouses, and different synthesis, different indicator, lists of indicators that come from research that nonprofits can draw from, and so forth. I think the challenge of those is that many of them are not. They're just as hard to wade through and read through as the research is itself. So, for a busy nonprofit staff member, trying to find their way through an arcane what works clearinghouse is time consuming and often just too hard to get through. It's not built for purpose, in terms of ease of use, which sort of goes to the challenge on the research side, which is to do that translational work. And Amir, I know that you have been working on that with your team, and I think have done a really nice job. And it's a great example of translating serious research into digestible narratives and lessons for practitioners to understand and apply. But it is not the norm. Most research is done, and good research is focused, it's narrow often. And so what you might know with certainty from a narrow research study is not necessarily the most applicable to a practitioner, dealing with whole people, whole families, whole problems. So I do think there are resource constraints on the nonprofit side. There are kind of structural constraints on how research is conducted. And then there is, a need to do much more and better translations still between the research community and the nonprofit community. So I think the kinds of work that you're doing is great. There are other efforts like Project Evident is a new effort, trying to bring more evidence to bear to practitioners out in the field. So I do think that there are promising efforts, but we need a whole lot more of them, and they need to be ongoing because research continues to evolve and practice continues to evolve.
Right, absolutely. It can't be a one-off thing and say we've checked that, we've done one translation. We have to kind of create new communities and new networks that are kind of joined up better than we're still too separate right now. Yeah.
One more thing I would say about that, and it kind of relates to the feedback work and listening to community, is that I do think that the practitioner often sees the researcher as a little bit out of touch, living in an ivory tower, only caring about, their research and their theories, and a little bit not so connected to lived experience and not really valuing people's lived experience, which continues to evolve in real time. I think that has led the sector, and I think this is sort of a little bit of a newish phenomenon, which is to lead the sector to sometimes be a little bit more anti-intellectual because they feel like, that the academics are a little out of touch. The researchers are a little out. So, I think demonstrating the ways in which research isn't out of touch and really listening, and you used the phrase earlier in your talk about being led by curiosity, and I love that. But being curious about the issues that are on real people's minds and really connecting with them to bring both the research and experience together, I think has to be part of the solution.
Absolutely. I think we need to be curious not only about ideas, but people, and then see how the ideas can help those people. I think that's the challenge that we're going to keep fighting on. That's great. So related to knowledge in some ways, and the power of knowledge and the way it's structured is something else you're an expert on, and that's on evaluation, outcomes, and metrics, which are seen by many critics as a way of replicating kind of existing structures and processes that perpetuate the advantages of those who have easier access to resources to be able to generate the evaluations and measure systematically all the time. So how do you engage in strategic philanthropy that's both rigorous but also equitable when it comes to measuring outcomes and evaluation?
Yeah, well, I appreciate that you linked strategy in with evaluation because it is linked. I think you begin by engaging people on strategy. So as you're developing your strategies, seeking input early on, again, not developing a strategy in a conference room, but as you're thinking about what is the problem we're trying to solve or contribute to solving, bringing in different views of practitioners, of nonprofit leaders, of community members to help us have a more well-rounded view of a problem and how we might contribute to solving it. And then the same will follow with evaluation. So if this is what you're trying to accomplish, are you seeing the progress that you expected, and bringing nonprofit perspective into framing up your evaluation as well? What are the questions we're seeking answers to? What are the questions that your grantee partners are seeking answers to? The best evaluations in this field are the ones where there is some overlap in interests between what we want to know as funders and what our grantee partners want to know in order to improve their practice. Ideally, one of the two best practices I'll offer here are one, to have an evaluation advisory committee. This is, to invite grantee partners on to advise on an evaluation. to give their perspective in an ongoing way about the questions you're asking, the methods you're using, helping interpret what comes back as the information begins to come back, and frame up the implications for practice. So advisory committee participation, and then to the extent that funders can do this, and we try to do this whenever we can, is produce evaluation reports that are both for us, but then have segmented reports for individual grantee organizations. So here is the feedback for the funder for the portfolio overall, but for each of, say, the 15, 20 grantee organizations that have been part of this work, giving them their own separate evaluation so they get the benefit of that feedback and can take action that's appropriate for their work.
Great. Again, the listening theme and being respectful of
Yeah.
the joint work, that's great. So they've got some good questions coming up, but I want to just touch on the theme of wealth and the role of philanthropy and democracy. And many of us on this session have read Rob Reish's book, Just Giving, and the problems that he identifies for organized philanthropy and our democracy. You see it on many of our students' desks or have over the last couple of years. Yeah. You are engaging, Rob, in an interesting and innovative experiment that is trying to bring scholarship to practice. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, I know Rob well. We've been long-term supporters of Stanford PAC, their philanthropy and civic engagement, civil society work. I was in a couple of different talks with Rob, and I hosted one where I was interviewing him for on his book at the Hewlett Foundation. And afterwards, Rob is so smart and so thoughtful and a great provocateur in the sector. But where I've always felt that he's fallen a little flat, and I told him this too, is in his recommendations, because foundations will say, okay, I understand your theory, your philosophy, that is it consistent with a democratic society and so forth, but you do support, the bigger foundations to do innovation. But they ask him for advice, and the advice that he gives falls a little flat, the peer reviews and so forth. And I think that is because he really has never worked inside of a foundation, so he doesn't really know what life is like in the kinds of foundations even that he ends up supporting. So we invited Rob to be a fellow in our Effective Philanthropy Group for a 9-month period or so, and he accepted. And the idea was for him to be there and soak up, what is it like to actually be inside a well-run foundation, and what does the day-to-day look like? How do we actually get our work done? How do we develop strategies, evaluate them? How do we interact with one another? Does it feel like a plutocracy? Like what are the discussions that we're having? What are the real issues that we're wrestling with as we're trying to see results in the areas we care about? And he accepted the invitation. He was grateful for it. And there was no major quid pro quo. Like we didn't want him to produce, an expose or anything. It was just for him to benefit his own learning and research. And we wanted to hear from him at the end any reflections that he had. So unfortunately, his fellowship with us began in March. So, the timing turned out to not be great. He was a great sport, and he did join us. He joined in for team meetings and all staff meetings and a couple of sat in on strategy, but it was all Zoom, and it was all remote, and it didn't quite have the same, we weren't able to quite achieve the same purpose that we had intended. So we agreed that we would sort of cut this period short in its room, and that Rob will come back once we're all able to be back in the building. But I was excited, and he, I think, was really thrilled to have the opportunity. And it's not just Rob, it's so many of the critics in philanthropy, even in the philanthropy infrastructure organizations, they offer good critique, but most of them have never worked inside of a foundation. So in terms of the advice they give, sometimes it's not, it doesn't always land because they don't have that practical lived experience of working inside a foundation.
Well, this is one of our audience members, Professor Les Lankowski, who was Rob Reish's interlocutor when he visited us last year, was listening to our conversations about the kind of the gulf or the divide between research and practice. And this is really kind of coincidental. He said, what would you think of a fellowship program that would enable researchers on philanthropy to spend a year at Hewlett or other foundations? So it was interesting that he thought of that just as about I was about to ask you about the Rob Reish experiment. But let me ask you one. Let's go to the audience questions. And one of our alums, I think she's one of our alums, and we didn't specify ground rules, so I won't put her name out there. But she asks, what are your thoughts on fiscal sponsorship as a way for organizations, particularly emerging ones, to have solid back end support?
Big fan. I mean, I think fiscal sponsorship is, a good vehicle, probably an underutilized vehicle and a less understood vehicle in the sector. But for just the reason that the questioner asks, it's an opportunity for, new efforts, new ideas to be able to find expression in the work much more rapidly. And they could stay fiscally sponsored. As they mature, they might want to spin out, but it gives them a little time to figure out, to get going on work while they're still figuring out their organizational structure and backbone. But they have a built-in backbone and all the operational efficiencies for them to just get going on whatever work it is that they want to do, that they've been established for.
Do you see the expansion of the fiscal sponsorship model as a way to build organizational capacity, kind of that's missing in the field, to have that whole model grow significantly larger? Do you think that would be beneficial?
I think, it's hard to say. I think I just say it's an underutilized tool. So I think fiscal sponsors can continue to grow and mature too, in terms of what they offer and how they support these efforts. I think some fiscal sponsors are probably better than others. And I think they could think about, whenever you're an intermediary of any sort, you have to do a lot to really add value. And so one of the ways I think that fiscal sponsors fall short is that they don't always offer the services, the infrastructure around things like strategy and evaluation. So, many fiscally sponsored efforts, are born out of passion, but they are not necessarily systematically reviewed and understanding the progress that they're making, the results they're achieving.
We have another question from Professor Les Lankowski. He says that Candid reports that foundations have committed $4 billion to racial equity since the protests began, but only $3 billion over the past 9 years. So he wonders why as a funding community we were relatively slow to catch on to racial equity, and what that portends kind of for long-term future funding.
Yeah, that's good. I would be curious to hear Les's take on that too. I mean, I think it's a good question. You could ask a similar question for why funders aren't funding in other areas that are clearly important, clearly existential facing our society, like climate change. Climate change, clear existential challenge, and about 1% of philanthropic funding goes to climate. A lot of reasons why funders don't fund in an area. Some of it has to do with donor intent and how foundations were structured to begin with, where they feel they can make a difference. I think there are many funders now who feel like there is a moment right now where we can make a difference. So I think that's where you're seeing now the surge in interest and commitment. I think there is a risk, and we've heard a lot of feedback to us from different community leaders. There's a risk in terms of all this money flowing. In some ways, it's really good news, In other ways, there are risks about money going to, unproven, either on both sides, we've heard it, going to unproven new efforts that actually don't have a track record, aren't necessarily trusted in community, or money going to just the usual suspects and not to any new efforts, and won't actually produce any new results. And then there's a third concern, which is that you've got funders who maybe, like, you could put Hewlett in this category, who don't have expertise in this area. So if we're going to be funding in anti-racist work, we have to develop our own skill and knowledge base around this. We're doing our first tranche of funding with a lot of advice from leaders in the Black community, leaders in the anti-racist community, who are saying, if you're going to get $15 million out the door this year, let us help you, give you some lists of vetted organizations and some ideas of where that money can be well spent. And so those of us who are newer to funding in this space need to be very open to advice and guidance.
That's great. I think that's smart, good wisdom, and very, very shows some humility as well. And Les says that his column on this is coming out in the Chronicle soon. So.
Okay, I'll look for it, Les. Thank you.
One of our PhD students asks that she appreciates the Hewlett Foundation seeks to lift up constituent perspectives, but she wonders whether efforts to amplify the voices of beneficiaries is best managed by nonprofits or foundations that fund nonprofits. Is there a chance that foundations leading this charge may discredit or limit the ability to strengthen the role nonprofits play or could play and help to lift up constituent voices?
Both and. It's a great question. And I usually don't like that phrase, both and, but in this case, I think it's true. So I think, it depends on different contexts. So in the Fund for Shared Insight, which we were talking about earlier, we looked around to see, are there good tools about 6 years ago that any nonprofit can use to listen to their clients, their intended beneficiaries, their participants, however you want to, whatever phrase you prefer. And we didn't find one. We found a lot of homemade tools, but nothing that could be used sector-wide. And so to make a very long story short, we created one called the Listen for Good tool, which borrowed some from the business sector. We centered the Net Promoter Score as part of that tool. But basically, we developed a very simple but elegant, because it can be comparative, simple feedback tool that could be used by any what we call customer-facing nonprofit who wants to listen to their clients or participants and get feedback and use that rapid feedback loop to make improvements in their services and in how they work. And it can be benchmarked, one to another for similar programs. So if you're a senior program getting feedback from seniors, you can compare your results to other senior programs. And so you can compare like to like, which is what you want to be able to do in any kind of measurement scheme. In that case, we set up a tool and a system that centers the nonprofit, just as your questioner was asking. The nonprofit is using this very simple tool that has been tested and validated, and getting feedback from their participants. The feedback is actionable because they can take action right away to respond to preferences and insights shared by their customers. But we also ask that the nonprofits share the feedback that they're getting and the insights that they're deriving with their funders. So in that case, the nonprofit is at the front lines and they're getting that feedback, but sharing the insights so that funders have the benefit of understanding what are consumer preference, what are participant preferences, and how might that inform our funding. In other cases, the funder might want to go direct to community members. So when we refreshed our Western conservation strategy, we had our staff went and had listening times with community members who were members of Native American tribes who care about preserving land in the North American West, but had not been a key part of our strategy before this time, or listening to the Latino community members' concerns about how they might access more natural environments and what was stopping them and so forth. And so having our staff be directly listening to community members' concerns and aspirations about open spaces was crucially important to helping inform the next stage of our strategy, which now supports many different community-based efforts and community organizations to work in unlikely partnerships where you've got the tribes working with the sportsmen and the anglers. And so there's different things that we can do and support and relationships that we can help broker if we are doing some of the listening ourselves too.
That's great. Well, other than hiring good listeners, I don't want to let you go without asking you, since our school, educates and attracts people who have a passion to work in the philanthropic sector, what do you look at when you're hiring people for your foundation? How do you advise grantees and nonprofits when they think about talent that they want to attract? And in that context, to tell us a little bit about how you ended up in philanthropy as well.
So it's a big question, Amir. I mean, I ended up in philanthropy by accident, in a way. I had my own firm based in the Bay Area, working with foundations and nonprofits. I was lucky, and we were doing evaluation work, strategy work, organizational planning work. I was lucky enough to kind of come of age during a very interesting time in philanthropy in the Bay Area, where there was lots going on around social entrepreneurship and blending sector lines, and lots of interest in interesting approaches to measurement, and the whole social return on investment movement and blending strategy and evaluation. So I feel like I got lucky to be wanting to do this kind of work at a time when the foundation world was interested in being more creative and rigorous in these regards. And while doing that work and raising two small kids, I got a call from the Gates Foundation to help them come start this new team. So it really was an incredible opportunity of a lifetime to go and help them start this new team, where I stayed for 4 years. But it wasn't like I had designs on going into philanthropy. I loved the work I was doing. I had a lovely, small company, a boutique kind of consulting group, and we had the luxury of choosing clients and having a very balanced life. So going in from that very balanced life to the wild world and great world of the Gates Foundation, where it was more 24/7, was a little unexpected turn. But since then, I ended up staying on the side of the table of philanthropy, but working in a few different places, as you noted earlier. When I'm hiring folks, I look for kind of a combination. I'd say it's a combination of, just to simply put it, kind of heart and head. That I want them to be curious. I look for curious people who aren't intellectually rigid or ideologically rigid. So they're intellectually curious, passionate about the work, care about making a difference in the world, team-oriented, sense of humor.
Great. Well, that's the kind of students we like to attract to our school as well. So I know you have a hard deadline, so I want to thank you so much for stimulating and enlightening conversation. And we crammed in a lot into an hour, and we have a lot more to discuss, and hopefully we can do that in person when you come visit us.
Great.
So thank you also to our many participants on Zoom for joining us to explore perspectives on philanthropy. We will convene next on September 17th at 1:15 p.m. Eastern Time, when we'll be joined by Brian Gallagher, President and Chief Executive of United Way Worldwide. Thank you so much, Fay. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Amir.
Bye-bye.
Take care.